Welcome everyone, and thanks so much for joining today's webinar. Today we have Dr. Frank Keefe presenting How Do I Respond to a Summary Statement? And just a couple of housekeeping items. All of our attendees are muted and video cannot be turned on. We also ask that you please use the Q&A feature to type in your questions, and we'll address those questions at the end. Dr. Keefe might also ask you to chat in some responses, and so we hope that you engage in the chat as well. And if any questions come up are more technical in nature, feel free to chat me directly. On today's panel, we also have Dr. Christine Ritchie, co-chair of the PCRC and representing our executive committee. So I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Ritchie, and please formally introduce our speaker.
Greetings, everyone. We're so glad that you're here with us today. And I'm always delighted for the opportunity to introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. Frank Keefe, who is in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience and a professor of medicine, rheumatology, and immunology at Duke University Medical Center. He is an incredibly well-respected and well-known investigator in symptom science, and particularly as it relates to how to integrate sort of the psychological framework in navigating symptoms, pain, and distress. His current research portfolio includes studies on coping skills for colorectal cancer survivors with pain and distress, and caregiver-guided pain management training and palliative care. He's also an amazing mentor and has an incredible track record of mentoring students and early career professionals, and has been a key lead and director of our PCRC Clinical Trials Intensive. I could go on about him, but in the interest of time, I will just say that it's been a great joy for us to have Dr. Keefe as a key member of the PCRC, and for always giving us new ideas for how we can do a better job with our research. So I'll turn it over to you, Frank. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and welcome to everybody to the webinar. This is one of my favorite talks to give, and I've sort of been involved in all sides of this particular webinar. I've written summary statements, I've received many summary statements, and I know the challenges on all sides of this. I've also helped a lot of people interpret a summary statement and kind of get past it. And one of the things that we know is that it's really, really difficult to write applications. And sometimes it's even more difficult to read through the summary statement. This is a real challenge. You've put your thoughts, your sweat, your blood into an application, and it could be a small number of people, or if you got through the entire review, a larger number of people looked it over, and what you see is a distillation of their comments. And you know, they may have missed things, or misinterpreted things, or they may be spot on. It's very, very challenging. And what I find is that this aspect of grantsmanship, that is reading and responding subsequently to a summary statement, doesn't receive the kind of attention I think it really does need to receive. And I developed this talk really out of a hope of sharing some of my experiences and some of my colleagues' experiences with both reading and responding to these summary statements. And be very interested in your responses. I'll be asking you for some tips based on your own approaches a little bit later in the presentation. So this is an overview of what I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to take it from kind of this event. You know, what is it like to read that summary statement, and then move on to think about how you might respond. And I'm going to share with you a structured approach that we've used. It's not necessarily the best, but it's one that's worked for us. And then I'm going to talk about the all-important introduction to your revision. I think this, again, is an area that is framing your introduction, writing it in a succinct and powerful fashion is one of the things that doesn't receive enough attention among those of us who work in the grant writing and in research area. I thought a good way to approach this is actually move away from grantsmanship and grant writing and reading summary statements to a different event, and kind of put this in context by looking at a slightly different event. And this event is related to this question. So I'll ask you to just think for a moment, how many of you in the audience are confident that you can ride an ordinary? Just think about that. How confident, just think about your confidence level. Now, if you're puzzling, I'm going to give you a tip. This is what an ordinary is. An ordinary is the first bicycle approach. I'm into bicycles, as you'll see as we talk today. And you can see they're kind of challenging. Basically, there was no chain, drivetrain on an ordinary. You basically had one big wheel at the front. The pedals were locked to that wheel, and all the power came from your legs. And the height of the wheel would vary depending on how tall you are. So really, if you're a tall person, you'd have a pretty tall bike that you'd be sitting up on. And you'd be on that front seat, and you'd have a tiny little wheel behind you. And you could imagine this was somewhat challenging to ride. You're pretty high off the ground. Maybe you could be successful in getting on it, but it's kind of hard to stay on there. And despite that, the ordinary became very popular. So if we go to cycling history, the early 1800s, they were so popular that clubs were formed. So here you see a club of men, and they have uniforms, and you can see they're freewheeling down the road here. People actually cross the United States on these, and so on. And I have this picture of this woman because the social history of cycling, bicycling on these ordinaries really opened up opportunities for women to get outside the city and to, with other women, form clubs and get a little bit more freedom on their part. So it was very popular. It was the type of bicycle. That's why it was called the ordinary at that time. Extremely popular, and particularly popular among younger people and affluent people who could afford these machines. However, there was an event that could occur with this particular bicycle, and it's illustrated in this next slide. And the event is called taking a header. So one of the problems when you have a big front wheel like this, if you happen to hit, this might be a turtle that he hit, or a rock, or a rut in the road. You notice the roads in that last photo I showed you were kind of dirt. The roads weren't very good. They're nothing like we have now. If you hit one of those, you would take a header, and that means you would fly over the handlebars, usually hit your head. And then there'd be these people standing off to the side, probably chortling, like that was probably not really smart to even ride this thing in the first place. And as you can imagine, this could be quite embarrassing. Despite this fact that this would occur, people really wanted to be able to ride. And you might imagine if you were learning to ride one of these and this event occurred to you, you might have different reactions. So imagine yourself taking your first header. Maybe you really hit your head. You're sitting on the side of the road here. What might be going through your mind? Well, you might be thinking, particularly if there's people watching you, I'm a failure. I'm never going to learn to ride this thing. Everyone is laughing at me. In fact, that may be true. Everybody on the side road might be laughing at you. And you might just think, riding an ordinary, it's stupid. Why am I bother doing this? This is kind of a crazy thing to do. And what might you do? What might be your behaviors and related to those thoughts? Well, and feelings. Maybe you feel very ashamed. Maybe you're very discouraged. Or maybe you decide, I'm going to isolate from others. No one's going to watch me learn this. Or you basically procrastinate on getting back on. Or maybe you give up. So there's a whole range of feelings and behaviors that might occur. And I should point out that these were common kind of responses. And what it led to is the advent of the bicycle that we now know, which was called the safety bicycle. So if any of you have a bicycle, my guess is it probably has two wheels. The tires probably are pneumatic. That is, you have to put air in them, so the ride is comfortable. That was not the case with the ordinary. And you're not very high off the ground. You can probably put your feet on the ground. When you slow down, you can reach the ground pretty easily. And that's now the bicycle that we think of. And not surprisingly, given how safe it is, the safety bike very quickly supplanted the ordinary. And now there are very few of these ordinary bikes around. They're mostly curiosity objects. Now, what does this have to do with reading a summary statement? Well, let's take it a bit further, and I think you'll see. So what if we, instead of falling off a bike and having a header, what if the event is different? Well, think about how confident are you that you can get a fundable score on your grant application the very first time you try? Again, kind of think of what's your level of confidence about that. It's tough. And then let's think about what is the event. So often, the summary statement comes back, and it's very clearly indicating your grant didn't get a fundable score. In fact, it may not even have been discussed. It's a tough event to have. So now let's kind of do the same thing we did with taking a header. Let's think about some of the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that occur. And I can vouch for these because I've experienced almost all of them myself. So you might be thinking, I'm a failure as a grant writer. My ideas are really not good enough. I'll never be able to get funding. Everyone else who has gotten a grant is looking down on me. All my colleagues, they're sitting around in their offices flush with money. They're all kind of looking down. Why couldn't you get a fundable score on this grant? You might start thinking, well, the comments are really off base. In fact, they're totally off base. And the grant reviewers are out to get me. It's probably the third reviewer. It's always the third reviewer. I don't know why, but they're really out to get me. And maybe you're thinking, you know what, getting a grant isn't that important to me anyway. I'm going to go into something else. Maybe I'll do clinical work. I'll give up on this area. Forget it. And what are some of the feelings and behaviors? Well, you may feel very ashamed. You may be very anxious. So anxious that it's hard to read the statement. You're up that next night. You might feel so discouraged. Maybe you get really depressed about your abilities and so on. And what are some of the things that go with that? You might start isolating yourself. I'm not going to let anybody know what my score is. I'm going to hide out in my office for a while. Of course, it's easy to do this remotely. And maybe you really put off doing anything else with that grant. Maybe you give up with that line of research or give up on writing grants in general. And I can tell you these are common responses, the thoughts, the feelings, and behaviors. Many of us have experienced these. And it's something that we need to learn to cope with. And one of the things I'd like to do at this point, rather than focusing any more on these maladaptive ways of dealing with this, I'd love to get your thoughts of how do you respond? What are some adaptive strategies? What are some coping efforts that might work? And if we can get these in the chat, I can't, for some reason, I'm not able to see the chat at the same time I see the rest of this. So I've got to get the chat going here. But if you could put into the chat function some of the efforts that you all have used, and I'll see if I can get the chat function to come up here. Here it is. Okay, so here's one from Sharon. Really good. So it directly addresses the thoughts. Consider it a learning experience. So rather than saying, oh, this is a failure, I can learn some things from this. What did I learn from this? That's excellent. Talk it out with colleagues who might be able to have a broader perspective, and particularly trusted colleagues. Take a few days away from the summary statement, and then come back. Excellent. Let's see here. Make a table of comments and potential responses. Excellent. So make a plan. It's from Jennifer. What else? Focus on publishing a paper. to get a win. So maybe it's related. Maybe they said you didn't have enough. Oh, here's a good one from Jennifer. Buy a bike. Excellent. Maybe some exercise would be a great technique for coping. Try not to think of it personally. I'll make these a little bit smaller. Another one here, talk to your program officer. Maybe there's some additional information available through review that would be really helpful. Oh, this is interesting. So Mary Isaacson is saying, I'll just say, first be upset. Allow yourself to be upset, but that's okay. And then become more objective. Now, several of you mentioned, like Mary does here, talking with your team, talking with your colleagues. That's come up several times. What is it about talking to others? What is the benefit of that? Why do that? What comes out of that? What are the upsides? I think it's something a lot of us do, and it counters that tendency to isolate and to be shameful and hide and so on. Okay, several people mentioned normalizing. Yeah, others may be more objective and be able to read the comments, maybe put them in more of, you can learn from this. Others can provide tips on design changes, prioritizing. Others can help in prioritizing things to change versus not. That's really good. Moral support. Oh, I love this last one from Mary. Mary's whipping a lot of ones out here. But it really builds on, if you've done this on team and a kind of community approach. That's really important. And, I think probably many of you have found that your publications that get accepted now and your grants that get accepted, they often are cross-disciplinary. They represent a team approach. And viewing this, responding to the summary as a team approach, I think, is so important. Other people may have very different perspectives on a comment, or maybe it's hard for you to understand why that comment was made, but somebody from another discipline, maybe the discipline of the reviewer, might understand better the comment that was made and so on. Let me ask you another question. I think that distress, anxiety, depression, fear is a really important part of what people are managing, particularly as they start to actually get back to the grant writing. I find as people working on the revision, they're constantly thinking about what's the outcome going to be this time, and they get kind of hung up and they keep like re-wordsmithing a phrase or a section of a grant. What can be done to manage that anxiety, fear, and psychological distress? What strategies do you think work? Physical exercise, yeah. Leave it alone for a while. Let that anxiety dissipate. Meditation, here's a nice one, or prayer. I love this last one from Ashley, being aware of some of the patterns, the work-life balance. I was involved for years with the NHLBI OBSSR program for training young investigators in how to write randomized clinical trial applications. And one of the favorite offerings that were started actually as a result of suggestions from the fellows was to ask the faculty to get up at the front of the room and form a panel, and the fellows could ask any question they want. And the questions often were right around this issue that Ashley brings up. How do you do this? How do you keep a balance in your life between work and the rest of your life? And every one of the people at the front of the room had struggled with this and had developed over time a strategy that worked for them. And it was just very, very impressive. For some, it was regular exercise. For some, it was really setting boundaries. There were certain days that they would work on a grant, other days they wouldn't. They'd really devote to other activities. One of the things that I decided to do early in my career, once I had children, is not bring any work home. So work during the day and not work on the weekend or the evenings. And the only time that I'd vary from that, if I had a grant due, I would allow myself to go in for Saturdays. But other than that, I pretty much kept that distinction, and was able actually to find that at work I became much more productive because I only had so much time. I know Bonnie Spring talked about what she called her sacred day. So there would be a day when she would meet students and colleagues, and they'd work on writing together. I think it was a coffee shop that they would meet at. And everybody knew that you couldn't call her that day and couldn't expect other meetings with her. That was the sacred day when those activities were done. Other days, there were a variety of other things that she did, and it made it a really nice environment for everybody to be able to pick up their coffee and chat and kind of just focus on one thing. So I think that there's a lot that you deal with in going through this, and I think some efforts really do help counter this response that we talked about a little bit earlier. But it's something that I think everybody that's successful ends up dealing with at some point. Now I want to share my screen, my full screen again. So that's not it. Maybe Naomi, if she's still on, can remind me how to go back to full screen. There we are.
You got it, that podium button right at the bottom.
There we are. Okay, so here's some coping efforts that potentially could work. Let me just share with you what we do, which is kind of an amalgamation of a lot of these things. So over time, we've developed sort of a structured plan for how to respond. And the first part of it is something that that you all suggested, which is also one of the first things that a program officer ever told me is read it once, then put it aside and don't look at it for 3 weeks. Really put the summary statement away. And it's amazing just doing that, not only how the distress dissipates, but also you can read a statement that just sent you into orbit the first time, but when you go back to it and have that perspective, that time to develop perspective, it ends up being something that, I can deal with that, or I can work with others to develop a plan to deal with that. So that's the first part of this. The second part is literally to pull in colleagues. So really, it's so important to involve your co-investigators and to very carefully read the entire summary statement And that involves the overall summary. So the very first part of a summary statement after your abstract has the summary prepared by the executive secretary of the study section. And what they try to include in that is not only an overall summary, but also comments that weighed particularly heavily in the decision and score for your grant application. So read that overall summary really carefully. And then, of course, carefully review every single comment made by the reviewers. And involving co-investigators in this, has already been suggested, is so important because they can provide a different perspective and input on why the comment was made, particularly if it's from somebody outside your discipline. And as one of you suggested, I think it was Jennifer, we make two summary tables. One is that we go through all these comments, the overall summary and the reviewer's comments, and list out strengths. And sometimes people forget to do that. They just jump over the strengths and go right to limitations because they figure, well, that's what really drove the score. But in fact, both strengths and limitations drive the score. So it's very important to take a look at both of those and how other people read and reacted to these two things in your application. So for example, strength table might look like this. You might list which reviewer, you might write in here the strength, and you could write down, why did that reviewer think that is a strength? So rather than just saying it, oh, the randomized design, maybe they said something about that. You know, no prior study has used this particular control group, maybe an attention control, or a treatment that's been used before. You're comparing a new treatment to an established treatment. And that's a really important comparison. So try to reflect as much as you can when a strength is listed by a reviewer or as part of the overall summary. Try to articulate why you think they viewed that as a strength. And then the second table really is for each reviewer and the overall summary, writing down the limitation briefly and writing down your idea at that point, how to respond. And then the final thing is your confidence that that response would satisfy them. So for example, they might say, you need an overall measure of psychological distress. That was not included. And maybe your response is, okay, I'm going to use the SCL-90R. And you're very confident, you know, that's been used before. So maybe you rate this 0 to 10, you say, well, that's a 9. That's probably going to satisfy them because I've used it before. It's widely used in the field. It's been used in this population. We didn't include it for such and such reason, but we will now include it and so on. Whereas other things, such as what control group to use, you might put down a couple of responses, but maybe you're a lot less confident that that will actually satisfy the concerns. So for example, I think a question here, why bother to put down strengths? Okay, I'll ask that for you. So for example, here's a couple of strengths that were noted in one of our applications. We included a long-term follow-up. Committee thought, oh, we really know very little about the persistence of treatment effects. Another strength they identified is you've taken these lessons from your pilot, you've used it to actually revise your intervention, your study protocols. And it was clear that they liked that because they thought it made the study more feasible. So again, using the chat function, what are some ideas about why this is particularly important? Why is it important to do this? You can build on these strengths. That's really important. So maybe in building, maybe you want to highlight these. Maybe the reviewers found them, but they weren't really, you didn't shine a real light or really lift them up. They found them, but maybe you want to emphasize them even more. And maybe there are related things that you want to do. You can potentially include them in the discussion. Really good point, Sharon. So the discussion, I'm assuming you're referring to the introduction to the revised grant. Why not parrot back to them the strengths they found. Now, remember, when you write that introduction, you put a revision back in. There's a subgroup of the reviewers in the study section that will review your grant application in detail. But other members, and it might be more than half, might even be the majority, won't have read every single word in your application. Maybe they've looked at your abstract, but I guarantee you almost all of them will look at your introduction. And if you highlight in that introduction the strengths, look, this already went through review, here are things you really like, this is why you like them. It will remind them if they were on the study section before and saw it. If they weren't on the study section, it'll point out to them things that this study section, that's seeing the revised application, valued in this application, why it stood out, why maybe it did get scored, or why, even if it didn't, there was some encouragement to come back. So that point made by Sharon is very important. I think the point Emily makes here too, that simply listing these strengths and articulating the reason they were considered strengths really helps with the psychological distress that we all feel. And it helps us, I think, keep in balance. Sometimes we get out of tilt in responding. We get so focused on the negatives and what didn't come across or what didn't work or how unfair the reviewers were, that we forget that in fact there were things embedded in this that really were positive and important, and that we ought to acknowledge that. Not everybody gets strengths identified, and if you're getting some of that type of feedback, it's important to acknowledge it. Any other reasons why you might want to build on strengths or mention strengths or think about them? Yeah, really good point from Jacqueline here. It might be helpful to reflect back on these strengths and limitations in writing future grants. Somebody said early on, use the summary statement as a learning opportunity. And even if you decide not to put the grant back in, you learn something from this that can really help you with future strengths and limitations. So one of the things, let's say, for example, somebody had suggested including, highlighting these strengths in your subsequent application. One of the things you might decide to do is, somehow my strengths aren't getting across to my reader. I think what I'm going to do, I'm going to include a table in my grant, every grant from now on, where I really highlight strengths. Maybe it looks like this. Here are design strengths, here's some theoretical strengths, and why that strength is important. So when the reviewers look at the application, they can immediately see some positive aspects and why those are important, how they really informed our design, the rationale, and so on. And you know what? Once you start doing that, you'll find that the reviewers, in fact, do use that type of table. It's very helpful for them in organizing their thinking about what you did. Now, obviously, these need to be legitimate strengths. They need to be something that sets you apart from others working in the area. But I think it is a really nice thing to do and to build on, not only for that application, but future applications. It's also something that many of us don't do. So I'd really encourage you to think about that. Oops. Okay, so for limitations, this gives you an example of how you might respond. So say the overall summary, the thing that the executive secretary wrote has this sentence: the committee was in disagreement about the need for a control group. And then you're thinking, okay, how should you respond? So there are lots of options. So you could say, you're probably familiar with the work that Ken Friedland has done on control groups, appropriate control groups. I think he's done a wonderful service to the field by writing those articles. So you might say, yeah, we didn't have a control group. And perhaps as part of your discussion, some of you thought it's not important to include a control group given where we are at this stage in our research. Or you might simultaneously consider, we're thinking about a standard care control condition. Here's what we mean by standard care. Here's why we're doing this. Here's specifically how we'd address this. And maybe you talk to your colleagues, you think about this for a while, and you're not totally confident that either one of these things is going to do the job. You're not confident it's going to turn them around on this. So you might come up with those initial thoughts about how to respond, but your confidence level is not quite high, that high. So you're rated a 6. And what this signals to you is you look at your table, and of course, it gets updated as you do more work with the application. This is an area you want to continue to think about and to work on, and so on. So here's another quote from our summary statement. Methods for monitoring pain medications were inadequate. These could confound treatment effects. Any of you that work in the area of pain know this is like incredibly methodologically challenging to monitor pain medications. We know people have different metabolism rates and so on. And so, there's all kinds of issues that come into this. And from the people I've talked to, the experts, there is no perfect way to monitor pain medications in a way that's really practical and so on. So one of the responses you might think about, okay, I'm not an expert in monitoring pain medications. I'm going to contact the world's expert in this area and say, would you be a consultant on my grant? Or maybe a few experts. Maybe you have an expert at your own institution. And what you might put in your reply is, we've really consulted with Dr. X, who is one of the world's experts on this. We've thought this through carefully. We've looked at the pros and cons of different ways of monitoring medications and controlling for them. And now we have a more detailed plan for how we're going to monitor it, how we're going to quantify it, how we're going to analyze it, and so on. So sometimes what I find, and maybe you've seen this, that the limitations that reviewers identify are often the same things they're struggling with in their own research, that there is no perfect solution. And this is one of those, I can tell you in the pain area, one of those, there's no perfect solution to this. You could raise this about any grant, unless you take people totally off medications, which is impractical for if you're studying chronic pain. So there's no solution. And many times the reviewers want to see, we didn't really like what you did. It's not that great. What can you come up with? I'm going to throw this at you because I'm dealing with it. What can you come up with to deal with this? And they'll credit you if you work on it and so on and get input from others. You'll get credit for this. Another thing might be the plan for monitoring treatment fidelity was vague. So you can think about, okay, I'm going to carefully review the literature. I'm going to include some best practices for how you do this. We're going to include a treatment manual. We're going to audio tape sessions. 20% will be rated and so on. Of course, the way you're going to respond is going to depend. Is this an efficacy study? Is it an early stage study? Is it an effectiveness trial? Whatever. There are different ways that you can respond, but you can probably have a pretty good idea that you could fill in this box in a way that would satisfy the group. And maybe you've done that for other applications, so you know how to write that. So what you can see happens with this is that you can very quickly come up with this table. You can come up with potential responses, and you can get an initial sense when you sit down with your co-investigators. This is what I plan to do for this. What do you think? You can get an initial sense of your confidence and how well this is going to satisfy the reviewers. And that really helps focus your efforts. And, I know some, I'm thinking of one grant in particular, we were struggling with an issue. We were rating it like a 3 on here. It had to do with monitoring medications using MEMS caps and other automated methods. We were struggling with that, trying to get it up from a 3 to a 6 or a 7, really up until it just went in. And at the last minute, we put together the best thing we could, and the grant did get funded and so on. But some of these responses are going to require a lot more work because the response is not immediately apparent. And it really does help, I think, you channel your energy and efforts. So all of this is in the service of the most important thing that you do, which is writing this introduction to your revision. And as I mentioned, this is what, when the discussion occurs, let's say your revision comes back in and the people who are assigned to your application want to have it discussed. I can tell you everybody immediately turns to the introduction to your application and reads it. As the discussion is going on, they're reading it and digesting and listening to the discussion and comparing what's in your introduction. So it's really important to realize, spend your time on this introduction. Often you're only allowed a page, maybe a little over a page. It's an absolutely critical part. So what we do, the strategy that we've developed, always have the first paragraph be about the strengths. Remind them, this is where our strengths table comes in. Why they like this? What do they like about it? And why they liked it? So they are reminded. And then in the second paragraph, we tend to focus on the most important concern. So let's say it had to do with control groups. And this raised a whole bunch of issues for them, about controlling for attention, controlling for the credibility of the intervention. So it wasn't just the control group, but there are things attached to that. So what you want to do to this in this paragraph is pull those associated kind of concerns together into this paragraph and paraphrase. I don't actually take usually word for word what they said. I paraphrase it. I then say, why was this a concern, to the study section? And then I articulate, this is how we're going to address it. And this is how the way we address it will improve the study. I think all four of those parts is extremely important in these paragraphs. And then I'll go to another paragraph. I'll take, okay, what's the second set of concerns? So let's say you could group a bunch of these into outcome measures. And so in that paragraph, you repeat this sort of approach. Why was this a concern? How you're going to address it? How using these different measures, in fact, will improve it. And kind of going through, usually we have maybe 3 of these paragraphs in total, sets of concerns. And then we typically can group some miscellaneous concerns. So they might say, well, there was a typo in table 2, or you left out this area of research. Okay, we now include on such and such page a short review of that. And then we always include a final paragraph where we say, okay, how these changes as a whole strengthen the implication and also enhance the implications of your research. So helping them see, okay, you did all this work. What difference does that really make? Let's see, how to improve your responses for study summaries? Here are some tips. The most important thing that any of you can do for your own ability to get grants is to be on study sections. Nothing I have ever done helped me more. And that could just be a voluntary. There are programs at NIH. If you're not a reviewer, you can volunteer to be a reviewer. Many study sections will bring you in for one visit, and some of them have actually a mentor to work with you on this. If you can also volunteer for foundation review groups and so on. I would do that at every opportunity because you get to hear how people look at grants in your area and related areas. Extremely helpful. Also very interesting from an intellectual perspective. Second thing you can do, make it easy for the reviewers. When you're writing your introduction, include page numbers. So this first paragraph that we talked about, control group issues, you can see we address that on pages X, page 22, page 16, we made these changes. And the reviewer can immediately go there, and hopefully you've highlighted or you've used some shading in the bar opposite that so they can clearly identify. Just make it really easy. Read and revise your introduction and your applications early and often. This introduction really needs to be well crafted. I would not work on this as the last thing. I work on it as the very first thing, even before you make any changes to the text of the application. Put out a draft of this, get other team members to read it, give you feedback. Have people that don't work with your team, but they're experienced researchers. I was just on a call this morning with a rheumatologist, a senior basic scientist, and he was so helpful to my career early. He doesn't do applied research, he doesn't do clinical research, he sees patients. But he would look at my grants and he would come up with very important points that I had missed that really helped shape the application again and again. Even though it wasn't his area, sort of expectations that people in other areas might have about what should be there, or not understanding a particular term, or appreciating a particular concept or something like that. And I'm sure that several of my grants got funded because I did show the introduction as well as some other parts. Sometimes I'll just send a section of a grant that I'm working on to an outside person, somebody with outside our team, and their feedback's very helpful. And of course, be open to change. You have to be willing. There are changes I've made the day before I submit the application. There are changes that I've made that ended up being incredibly important from the perspective of the summary statement. People really picked up on and really liked it. It might have been I read an article that just came out on a topic the day before, whatever. But be open to change. This is an iterative process, it's a team process, and it really requires the ability to hang in there and sustain effort over time, despite setbacks and so on. So I am going to stop there and open the floor for discussion. And I hope you put in the chat or maybe questions, things you'd like to share or talk about at this point. I think it's a really, really interesting area that, again, doesn't get enough attention. How do you deal with conflicting reviewer comments? That's a really good one, Emily. What I would do is I would articulate the pros and cons of those conflicting statements. So, for example, I mentioned control groups. So you could say one reviewer clearly says, oh, it's premature to have a control group. You need to do this type of work. The other reviewer says, oh, no, you definitely need to be doing a randomized study at this point, and you need an attention control. And what I would do is have a paragraph where it might start something like, or even in the introduction, this seemed to be a central issue for several of the reviewers. And we gave this considerable thought. Our team discussed it. In addition, we went beyond that. We talked with some methodologists, study design experts in the field. And as we see it, there are strengths and limitations of both of these approaches. Here are some strengths of not using a control group at this point, et cetera, et cetera. Here's some limitations. Here's a strength of doing it with an attention control at this early phase, and so on. And then to say, okay, we chose the following approach. Maybe it's a midway point, or maybe you stuck to your guns that you initially did, but defend it. Then the reviewers can see that you've carefully considered this. And they may disagree, but the fact that you show an appreciation of the problem and really thoughtfully went through your decision, I think can really help. But logistically, what is the best way to revise the narrative within a grant or resubmission? Do you recommend highlighting changes in a different color or other strategies? I think color is great if it'll come through. Again, I'm a dinosaur, so back in our day, we simply highlight by putting a black bar next to the section in the margins that we changed. You can highlight it by bolding it and so on. I think the most important thing is that it's easy for people to see, and that you direct them to it. And that it's consistent throughout. But if color works, if you're confident it's going to get transferred through all the different iterations that might occur with your document, I'd go ahead and use that. One question I have for you is, you all have mentioned some strategies for coping with the reactions to a summary statement. Which of these do you feel has helped most in that it resulted in an application that really was viewed as much improved? Probably had a chance to reflect on that. Yeah. Emily points out, really giving it time to sit after your first read. Yeah. So I can approach it logically rather than emotionally. And, you know, I've certainly had it where I didn't look at it for 6 months or a year. I just basically said, really got hammered. Somebody had mentioned work on a paper. I probably do need to do some additional preliminary research, so I'd focus on that. And then you know, some of them, they're so rough, I'd come back and I'd say, yeah, I think I'm really in a different place now. I can read this more objectively, more logically. So it is tough. And I think giving it that time, be surprised the difference that makes. It's a good idea. What's another one that you think makes a difference? I'm curious about how much reviewing with a program officer. Yeah, it's interesting. Joanna just mentioned that. How helpful people have found that to be. What kinds of things you get from the program officer that maybe you didn't see in the summary statement or amplified on that. What's been helpful? What is helpful about meeting with your program officer on these things? Depends on a good one, but a good one can be really helpful. Encouraging, helping you focus on what is, you know, what are the priorities? Yeah. It's not always the control group, you know, maybe it was the lack of theory. You know, you had all the methodological bells and whistles, all the things people like to see, but you know, doesn't seem to be a clear theory, and without a theory, it's hard to see how might this inform our understanding of the area, contribute in some really basic ways to the science. So that might be something. Sometimes there are things that are hard to convey in the summary statement. Yeah, Connie brings up this point. The reviewers were wrong. They didn't understand mixed methods. So it was a bit tough to know how to respond. That's a really tough one, Connie, because I don't know, those of you who've tried to get, you know, you'd hope in that situation you could just ask for another study section, but it's really hard to do that. It's hard to get that request implemented. What we've done in those instances is assume that the reviewers are educable and really try to explain, for example, in this, why mixed methods are so important at this stage of the research, how it could actually really advance our program of research and the field at large. So rather than just saying they're wrong and we can't do anything, assuming that you can educate them. And you know, it's surprising how often that has worked out for us. Of course, other options would be to simply revise the grant and kind of have a new kind of aspect to it, but to use the mixed methods and resubmit it as a different grant. That would be another strategy. Another one would be to write to the executive secretary and raise this issue before you submit your next revision. Say, you know, I think the review committee could benefit from some expertise in mixed methods. Some of the comments reflected a lack of understanding in this area. You know, I'd like to request, here are a few names, you know, people like this might be appropriate. And the executive secretary may actually select one of those people or find someone else with some expertise. And if you can make a strong case, sometimes that will actually lead to the addition of a new reviewer who may have other concerns. But at least you get someone with that background. You know, it also suggests before you submit, and this is of course something NIH is really encouraging now, look at the composition of the study section and be sure there are some you know, individuals of type of background that would appreciate. Do you ever include tables in your revision letter? Revision letter is somewhat different. What I talked about is the introduction, which is the single page thing. Typically, we don't put a table there, but we will in the body of the text, as I mentioned, include a strengths table and a limitations table. We often do that in the narrative of the application itself. I have a friend, unfortunately, just recently passed away, Bill Maxner. He was at NIH for years, and he was an intramural investigator. What they do at NIH is they bring in external reviews committees. I think it's like every 4 years to decide if an internal program will continue to get funding. So obviously that external review is extremely important. And one of the things that his group did is a year or so before the external group came through, they would bring their own external group. They'd identify a group of people who were pretty critical and could give constructive feedback. And they do kind of a mock review at that, wherever they were at that point in their research. And this is like a program project, there are multiple studies. And what they did, which I thought was very effective, when they put in their actual grant, they would include, we had Dr. X, Y, and Z here. Here are things they were concerned about in the research that we were doing. Here are the changes that we've made in response to those external critiques that we really think strengthen the application that we're now putting in. So one of the things you can consider is getting interim feedback from external people, getting them to actually write, a critique of what you're doing. And then you can pull from that critique and put it into your introduction. This design was reviewed by several external people. Here are concerns. We took those really seriously. Here are the changes that we made. So that kind of thing, I think, served this investigator, Bill Maxner, very, very well over the course of his NIH career. But I think it can also serve us to be open to that and then to actually use that feedback, use that written feedback. Some of you have mock reviews that you do before submission. Allude to that. This was reviewed. They suggested this type of control. We decided to do that. We really thought about it. It actually does improve the study. Okay, I'm getting the hook from Naomi. The hook is coming and pulling me off stage. So I am going to stop my presentation there. And I don't know if Naomi or Christine are going to finish up, but it's been delightful to chat with you today. And I hope this has been helpful in your thinking about how to respond to a summary statement.
Thank you so much, Dr. Keefe, and thank you to everyone who's joined today. If all of our attendees do go to our website, we have another webinar posted for the near future. And next month, we'll have Drs. Devin Check and Cara McDermott kicking off their PCRC Special Interest Group on Implementation Science with their presentation, Implementation Research in Palliative Care, Foundations and Current Applications. We hope that you join us for those as well. And we'll also be sending out an evaluation where we gather other topics that might be of interest to you. So please take a minute to fill that out. And I want to thank you again, Dr. Keefe, and all of our attendees. Take care, everyone.